from Eduardo Galeano. Just to remind you of how an epigraph is formatted. From the open veins of Latin America, which is has been an inspirational book within Latin America. And for people even from the outside reading about it, enjoy. It was published in the 1970s by, and then it had a little bit, got another breath of life, and whenever Obama went down to the summit of the Americas, maybe about 10 years ago or so, when Hugo Chávez, then president of Venezuela, and who we all got really upset about because he claimed to be socialist. Anyway, he gave Obama this book, Open Veins of Latin America, which then resulted in a sales of the book. Bless you. So yes, this is a famous book, 5 Centuries of the Pillage of a Continent, which opens with the example of Potosí and got poor Eduardo Galeano in trouble. It was published in 1971. It got him banned, and then he got thrown in prison, and then he got forced into, had to leave Uruguay, go into exile. Back when books meant something, back when they were, could get you in trouble for publishing a book like this. So, kind of an important figure in Latin American history. Interestingly, for a person who's writes about European imperialism and the pillage of Latin America, that's what Galeano looked like. He was actually from Welsh and Italian great-grandfathers, Germany and Spain, so a very European-looking Latin American and Uruguayan. So, Lane asks, so when you go to Potosí's, the mines, when you go on a mine visit or you go to the mint, they talk about how many people perished working and around the mines and in the city and all those things. And it was a harsh environment. And so they cite this figure from Galeano of 8 million lives. Is it true? Asks Lane. There's no actual tally. You can't really know. He actually says that he uses this kind of, he dances around it a little bit. He says that all that we know from surviving records renders the number 8 million consumed by the Cerro Rico all but impossible to imagine given the scale of colonial Andean society. So he basically says, nah, you can't, no. All but impossible to imagine. It couldn't have been true. It couldn't have been that much. Interestingly, though, on the next page, on page 182, Lane, I'm standing in for him, says he doesn't want to pick a fight with Galeano, whose burning sense of injustice and penetrating intellect are sorely missed. I think what he's saying there is, okay, maybe he didn't get all the numbers right. Maybe some of the details got wrong, kind of like that guy who was citing from multiple sources that he just made up. But he did have something that was worth noting, which is this burning sense of what it meant to be justice and injustice and penetrating intellect. And yes, Galeano passed away in 2015, so he's sorely missed. Right before we got some cool stuff going on in 2016, and after the post-Obama era. It would have been interesting to have Galeano's insights on that. So, what Lane says instead, or he says he doesn't want to pick a fight, but he does want to tell us about what he thinks of Potosí as the kind of paradoxes. And he uses this word several times in this last section. And I think it kind of sums up pretty well what his summing up is about. And so, he says that it cast into sharp relief many of the paradoxes of global modernity, those things that are contradictory, right? That don't always, that are together, but don't always seem to go together. And it reminded me of something we did that maybe is back in your notes from a couple classes ago about, this. I think we got it pretty well. I think I did pretty well on this, that Potosí was this first global city that had both identities reimagined, but also the Basque and Vicuña wars and exploitation, but also a place of wealth and opulence, etc. So I think that we did pretty well back in the days trying to get a handle on some of these paradoxes of global modernity, which Potosí involves. He uses the word again in what will be a way too long block quote. Never do this in PowerPoint. Don't write this all down because it's in your book. It's on page, what are we going to quote from? 182. So he says that we may agree with Eduardo Galeano that the seeming paradoxes of colonial Potosí fit perfectly well inside the lopsided drama of Western imperialism and the global spread of capitalism, or the creation of an unfair world system that sucked peripheries like highland Bolivia dry. So again, he's saying that, in some sense, Galeano's sense of injustice and what had happened during the imperialist capitalist spread is certainly a lopsided drama, and we can agree with that. But if you take it too literally, or you get too polemical about it, even Galeano has said, maybe I'd tone it down or tone it differently if I had to write it again today. These grand narratives of exploitation compress and oversimplify history, strengthening the strong and weakening the weak. And so we talked about how we teach and do history and why it's important. And what I think Lane is saying here is if we overemphasize this kind of the evils of global capitalism and colonialism and imperialism, we end up simply reinforcing the old stories about the triumph of the triumphant. And in the same way that we talked when we were talking about the 7 myths of the Spanish conquest with Restal and talking about the importance of native allies in the conquest, if you do this sort of, the Spanish were all terrible routine too much, it simply glorifies in a different way or oversimplifies their accomplishments. Now, he then says that in this book, he hasn't wanted to simply flip the script or ignore the shifting locus and flow of imperial power, which is to say, this is something that historians started doing perhaps after Galeano. They started saying, well, we've paid too much attention to the powerful, paid too much attention to the great men of history. So we're going to write these histories that are only about the people from below. And Lane says that doesn't, you don't want to ignore the fact that there's power coming in from above. You can't just write about the people from below. So what does he end up with? He ends up with Potosí has always been a site of struggle and innovation, a dense concentration of predictable losses and unpredictable successes. An indigenous space and also a complex African and European one, a woman-centered world, despite powerful men's best efforts. We've talked about all these things. Perhaps the one thing that we might change in 2022 3 is capitalizing indigenous there. It looks strange to not capitalize indigenous, especially when African and European are capitalized. That's become more done these days. But the general idea, I think, the ideas behind it are a good. We've learned a ton about this first global city. So for me, I was excited to read this book, and I think, at least for my purposes, we learned a lot about the Silver City, much more than we ever thought we'd want to know. I still, personally, I feel like the subtitle of the book that changed the world, personally, I wanted to know a little bit more about how it changed the world. We learned about the history of Potosí, and we had some sense of currency crises and all the silver that it produced. But there were a few things that I still wanted to know. One of the things that I hoped would be answered in this book was how we got the dollar sign for the US dollar, that little dollar sign. If you go to the Potosí Mint and take the tour, they make a pretty convincing case that the piece of 8 on the pesos that were minted in Potosí, there was superimposed those letters. So you'd have a P, a T, an S, and an I. And if you superimpose them all, you end up with this thing that looks a lot like the dollar sign. There it is. Like I said, they make a pretty convincing case of that. And we actually do know historically that, in fact, the US dollar, when I hurt your feelings by ripping up that dollar, in the old days, you wouldn't have minded at all. People just burned them to heat themselves because they were worthless. So currencies have a way of sometimes becoming worthless over time because of inflation and all those things. And so people were not happy with the new revolutionary dollar right after the revolution, but the United States said, aha, what we'll do is we'll say this piece of paper is worth as much as what they called a Spanish mill dollar. So whatever happens, you can come in and we'll give you 1 Spanish peso for it. And so these pesos must have come, well, they were minted in various places. They could have been minted in Mexico. So they could have been Mexican pesos, which is fun to imagine that the US dollar was based on the Mexican peso, because now we think of it as completely the reverse. But it seems more probable, given the amount of silver that was produced, that they would have been exchanged for the Potosí peso. We also know this because if you talk to your, I guess it would be maybe your great-grandfathers, they'll talk to you about 2 bits and 4 bits and 6 bits, which is a strange expression to use for a dollar, but it comes to us from the pieces of 8, which you could then cut into pieces. And so if you had 2 bits, it was like a quarter. So my grandfather used to say, yeah, give me 2 bits for that, which is absurd, right? You're like, what are you talking about, Grandpa? But he meant a quarter, which was common slang at the time, and it's derived from the fact that, again, the dollar was once basically based upon the Spanish piece of 8. So we do know that the peso is where it was used. The dollar sign was used for what was called the Spanish dollar, or the peso sign. So we know that, but whether it actually comes from the Potosí Mint is debatable. And so I looked this up on Wikipedia because I always wanted to know, but they still don't know. Is it just an abbreviation for pesos itself, in which case the S was written over the P? There's a number of ideas or theories for how it's derived. So although the Potosí Mint makes a pretty good case, it has not been completely settled where we got the dollar sign. I was hoping that Chris Lane would wrap that all up for me, but he leaves it in the historical mist. At the end of his summing up book, he gives us a great example of a block quote. Again, too much text for PowerPoint, but bear with me. So this is his last point before the epilogue, which is a pretty good summary of what happens from the independence on. We humans get greedy and desperate, resorting to all or nothing pacts. Pacts. Saying that correctly? Pact. Can't pronounce the T. A deal, a bargain, resorting to all or nothing pacts. Yet one cannot really make a pact with Pachamama, Andean God of the earth, mother, who is the matrix, the giver of all life. She may weep for you or show you pity. She is not the one who will crush you or show you the way to bonanza. Can't make a pact with Pachamama. For the miners who lose control and get desperate, there is but one choice. Make a pact with El Tío. That's the kind of the devilish owner of the mine. It's like selling yourself to him body and soul, as if to say, give me riches and I'll give you my soul. You give your soul not to God, but to El Tío. Actually, all throughout Latin America, there's stories of people who make pacts, agreements with the devil, giving your soul for riches on this earth. These stories of Faustian pacts inside the mountain invariably end badly for humans. All right, here's what I want you to know from you. What the heck is he saying here in this next sentence? It's his last summing up sentence. Perhaps before the Cerro Rico collapses upon itself in a plume of red dust and the former imperial villa shrivels and dies for lack of water, we may ask ourselves collectively if we have made such a pact. You have these miners, right? You're at your wit's end, you're losing everything. So at the last resort, you make a pact with the devil. I'll give you my soul if you give me riches. You're visited by wealth and riches, but in the end, it doesn't turn out so well. Soul has been given to El Tío, who comes to collect, visit harm upon your body and soul. Had a good time while you were alive. So, before that big mountain collapses upon itself, before the town of Potosí, which I'll tell you about in the epilogue, is running out of water, we may ask ourselves collectively if we have made such a pact. It's you and me, Liam. We have to ask ourselves collectively, all together, plus all the people in this class, if we have made such a pact. What is the pact that we might have made? Huh? With the devil. For what? Riches. We may have, as a human society, I think what he's getting at here is we might want to ask ourselves, before this whole fucking thing crumbles to the ground and blows ourselves to bits, we might want to ask ourselves if our relentless pursuit of wealth isn't a pact that is going to not end well for human beings, right? We might want to question that. I guess it's a good thing he doesn't exactly say that, because he'd probably get in trouble. Maybe he'd get thrown in jail like Eduardo Galeano. It reminds me actually of something we talked about at the end of Restal as well, the age of expansion, right? What will things be like in a few hundred more years if we keep expanding at the pace we are? Have we made a pact with something else that is just no snow this winter? Nah, just kidding. Who knows why there's no snow? It's cold enough for snow. It's just not here right now. Was here last year. But, the overall idea is we may want to think about as a society whether or not pursuing growth, expansion, wealth, at what cost? At any cost? What should we do about this collectively?